Every morning, Gwen Araujo stood in front of the mirror and painted her truth over a world that didn't want to see it. To many, she was just another teenager in Newark, California. 17 years old, full of untapped dreams, contradictions, and confusion. But behind her eyeliner, her styled hair, her soft-spoken laugh, Gwen carried something fragile and profound. The fierce, unyielding desire to live as her authentic self in a world that could barely understand her, let alone accept her. She was born Edward Araujo Jr., but that name no longer fit. It had become a costume, a remnant of a life she had outgrown. Gwen was the name she chose for herself, inspired by her idol, the singer Gwen Stefani. It was a name that sang when she heard it, a name that made her feel like someone she could love. But love was complicated. So was identity. And trust? That was the most dangerous thing of all. Gwen's room reflected the two lives she straddled. On one side, posters of pop stars and notes scrawled with lipstick quotes. On the other, remnants of her past. Baseball trophies, old clothes her mother still folded despite never being worn. Her sanctuary was split, much like her life. One part vibrant teenage girl chasing joy, the other shadowed by the fear of being found out. School hadn't been kind to her. Even in a relatively diverse California suburb, being different meant isolation. Gwen was often bullied, laughed at, misunderstood. People whispered. Boys who flirted with her behind closed doors ignored her in the daylight. Girls she wanted to befriend eyed her with suspicion. The world demanded clarity. Gwen offered complexity. Still, she kept going head high, makeup perfect, shoulders squared. The only thing sharper than her cheekbones was her courage. Her mother, Sylvia Guerrero, loved Gwen fiercely but struggled at times to grasp the full weight of her daughter's identity. First, Sylvia thought it was a phase. Then came the awkward conversations, the tears, the hard truths. But as time passed, what began as confusion turned into a warrior-like defense. Sylvia didn't always understand Gwen, but she knew this. Her child deserved to live, fully, unapologetically, and without fear. But fear was never far behind. Gwen's journey into womanhood wasn't carved with affirmations or gentle hands. It was a road riddled with detours, brick walls, and sudden dead ends. She longed for belonging, for love, the kind in movies, the kind where someone saw her not as a question mark but as a girl worth holding. And in the crowded, hazy basements of teenage house parties, where music drowned out thought and vodka blurred judgment, Gwen chased it. She wasn't naive, not completely. She knew the risks of putting herself out there. But what was life if not a series of leaps? And Gwen had already spent too many years hiding in a skin that never felt like hers. So she leaped, again and again. One night, as strobe lights blinked in a cluttered garage and laughter slurred into arguments, Gwen met Michael Magidson and Jaron Neighbors. They were older, charismatic, loud, dangerous in a way Gwen didn't yet recognize. They flirted. She smiled. Drinks were shared. Secrets were not. To Gwen, it was a chance. Maybe this time it would be different. Maybe someone would see her and stay. She had no idea that this connection would one day lead her to a place from which she'd never return. What Gwen couldn't know, what no one could have predicted, was that behind those easy smiles and backward baseball caps, something darker stirred. An ignorance, a rage, a brittle masculinity that didn't know how to bend, only break. And when it broke, it would do so violently. For now, though, Gwen still danced in mirrors. She still rehearsed for a future where she could live freely. She still believed in the possibility of love. But love, she would soon learn, can turn. Before the headlines, before the courtroom, before the night that stole her life, Gwen Araujo was just a teenager trying to be seen. Born Edward Araujo Jr. on February 24, 1985, Gwen grew up in a modest home in Newark, California, a working-class suburb nestled in the East Bay of Northern California. Her upbringing was neither affluent nor easy. Her parents, Sylvia Guerrero and Edward Araujo Sr., separated early, and much of Gwen's childhood unfolded under the care of her mother, a woman both strong-willed and deeply devoted to her children. Even from a young age, Gwen stood out. As a child, she was sensitive, artistic, and drawn to the things society labeled feminine. While other boys roughhoused in the dirt or idolized action heroes, Gwen gravitated toward music, fashion, and dolls. First, it was innocent, quirky, something adults chuckled over at family gatherings. But as she grew older, the chuckles turned to concern. Teachers made notes. Family members whispered. Classmates became cruel. Sylvia tried to help in the ways she knew how. At first, she encouraged Edward to fit in, to try sports, to spend more time with boys. But when that failed, she found herself caught between instinct and tradition. Slowly, painfully, Sylvia came to understand that her child wasn't just different. Her child was Gwen. "I'm not gay, Mom. I'm a girl," Gwen once told her. A declaration that landed like thunder in a quiet room. That one sentence shifted the entire narrative of their relationship. Sylvia struggled to grasp it, to wrap her love around a truth she hadn't been taught how to hold. But she tried, and Gwen, seeing that effort, clung to it with a hopeful heart. By her mid-teens, Gwen began to embrace her identity publicly. She changed her name, styled her hair, began wearing makeup, and insisted on female pronouns. At school, it was a daily battlefield. She was mocked, bullied, sometimes physically threatened. One student even carved a slur into her locker. Teachers often turned a blind eye, unsure or unwilling to intervene. But Gwen refused to go back into hiding. She found moments of escape in music, especially in the pop-punk rebellion of No Doubt, her namesake's band. She journaled. She experimented with makeup in the bathroom mirror when no one was watching. And on the good days, she laughed. A laugh that could light up a room and disarm even the harshest critic. Still, her world was full of contradictions. By day, she fought to survive hallways filled with judgment. By night, she explored the glittery promise of teenage nightlife. Underground parties, new friends, and the dangerous high of being desired. It was at one of these gatherings, in the home of someone loosely connected to her circle, that Gwen began spending time with the group that would ultimately decide her fate. She was drawn to them for the same reasons most teenagers seek belonging: attention, excitement, and the illusion of being understood. Michael Magidson, Jaron Neighbors, Jose Merrill, and Jason Cazares weren't strangers to Gwen. Newark was a small town. Their paths had crossed before. They shared drinks, danced to loud music, and exchanged flirtations. Some of the boys were intrigued by Gwen's beauty and charm. They flirted with her, some privately, some openly. And Gwen, ever the hopeful romantic, thought maybe, just maybe, someone might love her for who she was. But the dynamic was built on shaky ground. The boys didn't know Gwen was transgender. And in that silence, a dangerous tension brewed. One made more volatile by the fragile masculinity they carried like armor. One night, someone whispered a rumor. A question floated around the room like smoke. Is Gwen really a girl? No one said it out loud to her. But Gwen felt it, in the way eyes lingered too long, in the sudden coldness of someone who'd once smiled. She had been here before. Suspicion always preceded cruelty. And yet, despite the warning signs, she didn't run. She stayed. Maybe out of defiance. Maybe out of loneliness. Maybe out of the eternal hope that this time would be different. She could never have known that the smallest crack in a secret could open a door to murder. But that's the cruelty of hindsight. It always comes too late. For Gwen, parties were more than just music and sweat and flashing lights. They were possibility. It was in these crowded living rooms and dim garages, filled with cigarette smoke and bass-heavy beats, that she momentarily escaped the labels the world pinned on her. Parties, she was just Gwen. Not an oddity, not a question mark, just a girl among other girls. Flirting, laughing, spinning beneath flickering lights. For a few hours, she got to live in the story she wanted to tell the world about herself. In early fall of 2002, Gwen began attending small house parties hosted by a group of young men from her neighborhood: Michael Magidson, Jose Merrill, Jaron Neighbors, and Jason Cazares. She had met them through mutual acquaintances, and in the close-knit, restless circle of Newark's youth, connections formed quickly and deeply, even dangerously so. The boys were part of the town's tight, hyper-masculine crowd. They worked blue-collar jobs, lifted weights, drove loud cars, and lived by the kind of code that made tenderness feel like betrayal. Yet, despite their bravado, Gwen intrigued them. She was beautiful, confident, and full of a magnetism that drew attention wherever she went. It started casually, Gwen talking with Merrill at one party, exchanging glances with Magidson at another. There were drinks, laughter, and long, lingering stares. Some of the boys flirted. Others watched from the edges, curious, cautious. Gwen was used to this. It wasn't the first time men had been attracted to her only to recoil at the revelation of her identity. But this felt different, felt more intimate, more dangerous. Some claimed Gwen had engaged in sexual encounters with both Merrill and Magidson. The truth of those moments would later be twisted in courtrooms and testimonies. But what's clear is this: Gwen, despite her guardedness, wanted to believe she was being accepted, loved, even. The risk was undeniable, but love always asks for a leap. And Gwen, brave, lonely, and 17, was willing to jump. Still, under the surface, the foundation was beginning to shift. By mid-September, whispers began to circulate. Someone said Gwen was not really a girl. A joke was made at a party. A sideways glance turned into suspicion. Rumors snowballed. Boys who had once flirted with Gwen began questioning themselves, not just about her identity, but about what it meant for them. To men like Magidson and Merrill, whose masculinity was shaped by locker room pride and street cred, the idea that they had been fooled, or worse, that others might think they'd been, was like a lit match near gasoline. They didn't see Gwen as a human being with depth, struggle, and soul. They saw a threat to their image. And in their world, image was everything. Jaron Neighbors, a longtime friend to both Merrill and Magidson, later described the mood in those days as darkening. The joking tone faded. There was anger in the way Gwen's name was mentioned. Talk turned to confrontation, then to humiliation, then to revenge. The betrayal wasn't Gwen's secret. The betrayal was how fragile egos, when bruised, can lash out with unimaginable violence. One night, Gwen showed up at yet another gathering. She smiled. She laughed. She may have even suspected something was wrong. The air was thick with unspoken tension, but Gwen had walked into discomfort before and made it out. What she didn't realize was that this time, she was walking into something far more sinister. The boys were no longer just curious or embarrassed. They were planning. They wanted answers. They wanted proof. And in their warped view of justice, they believed Gwen owed it to them. The stage was set. The mask was slipping. And the danger Gwen had danced around for so long was now closing in, fast and unforgiving. What began as flirtation had become obsession. And soon, obsession would turn to violence. The night of October 3rd, 2002, started like many others. Music, alcohol, and a restless energy humming beneath the surface. The party took place at Jose Merrill's house, a modest one-story home in Newark that had become a common gathering spot for the local crowd. That night, Gwen arrived wearing jeans and a stylish top, her hair done just right, her lips glossed to perfection. She had always paid attention to the details, not just because she liked feeling pretty, but because for Gwen, femininity was armor. If she looked perfect, maybe the world would treat her that way too. She didn't know that some of the boys she trusted had already decided. This night would be different. Michael Magidson, Jose Merrill, Jason Cazares, and Jaron Neighbors were there, drinking, posturing, and feeding off each other's paranoia. The rumors about Gwen's gender identity had grown louder. It was no longer idle gossip. Now it was confrontation. Now it was proof they demanded. Behind closed doors and behind Gwen's back, the men hatched a cruel plan. They would confront her, force her to reveal the truth, expose her in front of everyone. It was never really about understanding who Gwen was. It was about humiliation, control, retribution. As the night wore on, the atmosphere shifted. Gwen began to sense something. The way people looked at her had changed. Conversations stopped when she walked in. Laughter thinned. Her instincts screamed for caution, but she stayed. Maybe she hoped it would pass. Maybe she didn't want to give them the satisfaction of fear. Sometime during the night, the confrontation began. Accounts vary, but the general outline is devastating. The men, high on adrenaline, alcohol, and rage, cornered Gwen. They accused her, demanded to know if she was really a girl. They wanted answers that Gwen should never have had to give. This wasn't a conversation. It was an ambush. At some point, Michael Magidson forcibly reached between Gwen's legs to confirm what he suspected. In that moment, everything snapped. Their shame, their confusion, their bruised egos. It all coalesced into rage. Not against themselves or the toxic masculinity that bound them, but against Gwen. A girl who had dared to be loved, to be seen, to live. They claimed she had deceived them, that they had a right to be angry. But Gwen had told no lies. She had never forced anyone to see her a certain way. She simply was. That, for them, was unforgivable. What followed was chaos, violence, and cruelty. They beat her, punched and kicked her until she was barely conscious. At one point, she tried to get away, to crawl toward the door, but they stopped her. According to later testimony, Jose Merrill sat down and cried, his shirt soaked in blood. Jaron Neighbors left the room in a panic. But no one called for help. No one stopped what was happening. The violence continued. Someone grabbed a rope. Someone struck Gwen with a can of food. Eventually, someone delivered the final, fatal blow. A swing to the head with a shovel. Gwen Araujo was murdered in the early morning hours of October 4th, 2002. Her body, battered and broken, was wrapped in a blanket and stuffed into the back of a pickup truck. The boys drove her out to a remote location in the Sierra Nevada foothills, over 150 miles away, and buried her in a shallow grave beneath the trees. She had entered the party as Gwen, beautiful, hopeful, and alive. She left it silenced, discarded like a secret, and for the next 2 weeks, no one knew where she was. For 2 agonizing weeks, Gwen's mother, Sylvia Guerrero, waited for a call that never came. At first, she told herself it was just another teenage moment, a flare of rebellion, a weekend stretched too long. Gwen had done it before, but this time felt different. Her phone was off. Her friends hadn't seen her. No messages, no posts, just silence. And Sylvia knew. She knew in the way only a mother can when something unspeakable has happened to her child. She filed a missing persons report with the Newark Police Department. At first, the investigation lagged. Gwen had been known to vanish for a few days. A transgender teenager in a small town didn't always register as a top priority. But Sylvia persisted, visiting the station, calling every friend Gwen had, and handing out flyers with Gwen's smiling photo. Behind the scenes, guilt was beginning to crack the silence. Jaron neighbors, shaken by the brutal killing and haunted by what they had done, began to unravel. He confided in a friend, dropping vague but chilling clues. The friend, disturbed by what he heard, tipped off the police. Soon after, Neighbors was brought in for questioning. It didn't take much for the story to come loose. Under pressure, Neighbors confessed to what happened: the confrontation, the beating, the body buried miles away in the woods. His words shocked detectives. But perhaps most chilling of all was this: he spoke of the murder as though it were the only logical outcome to Gwen's existence. Not remorse, just reasoning. On October 18, 2002, police followed Neighbors' directions to a remote spot in El Dorado County, near the Sierra Nevada foothills. There, buried in a shallow grave, they uncovered the lifeless body of Gwen Araujo. The autopsy would reveal blunt force trauma to the head, multiple blows, a violent end. Back in Newark, Sylvia's world crumbled. "I felt like my soul had been ripped from my body," she later said. But even as she grieved, she refused to let Gwen's name be buried along with her body. Sylvia stood in front of the cameras and said her daughter's name loud and proud. Not as Edward, but as Gwen. She corrected reporters, demanded respect, and began to wage a war Gwen hadn't lived to fight. Meanwhile, Magidson, Merrill, and Cazares were arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Neighbors, in exchange for leading authorities to Gwen's body and testifying against the others, received a plea deal for manslaughter and voluntary testimony. The community was shaken. Some rallied behind the Guerrero family. Others whispered cruel things about Gwen, accusing her of deception, blaming her for the reaction she provoked. Transphobia crept into conversations and headlines. Even the legal system would struggle with the complexity of Gwen's identity and the question of whether her killers should be seen as cold-blooded murderers or victims of a deception. But there was no deception. There was only Gwen, a teenager, vibrant and full of dreams, silenced by men who couldn't accept her truth. Now, the truth was out, but justice, like grief, would take time. In early 2004, the trial began, not just of Gwen's killers, but of Gwen herself. Though she was not alive to speak, the courtroom became a battleground where her identity was questioned, her gender debated, and her worth as a human being dissected under harsh fluorescent lights. Her murderers didn't just defend themselves, they tried to make Gwen responsible for her own death. Michael Magidson, Jose Merrill, and Jason Cazares faced first-degree murder charges. The prosecution, led by Deputy District Attorney Chris Lamiero, argued the killing was calculated and rooted in bias, a direct response to the discovery that Gwen was transgender. It was a hate crime, even if California law at the time didn't clearly state it. But the defense had other ideas. They introduced what would come to be known infamously as the trans panic defense. Their argument was as chilling as it was offensive: that the defendants were so shocked, so psychologically destabilized by learning Gwen was transgender, that they acted in a state of uncontrollable rage. That the emotional toll of deception had driven them to temporary insanity. To the defense, Gwen wasn't a victim. She was the provocation. In court, Gwen's mother, Sylvia Guerrero, sat stoically through testimony that twisted her daughter's life into something shameful. The defense combed through Gwen's past, her gender transition, her private relationships. They used her identity like evidence, as though being transgender explained why she died. Sylvia later said, "It felt like they were putting Gwen on trial, not the men who killed her." Witnesses, including Jaron Neighbors, testified to the events of that night. He described in detail how Gwen was beaten, strangled, and buried. He gave the prosecution its clearest timeline, but his plea deal also drew criticism. To many, it felt like justice had already been compromised. Public interest in the case surged. LGBTQ+ advocates rallied outside the courtroom. News cameras followed Sylvia everywhere. Protesters demanded an end to the use of panic defenses in murder trials. Gwen's story had pierced something deeper, a cultural reckoning with how trans lives were seen, treated, and dismissed. The jury deliberated for days. Emotions ran high. When the verdict finally came, the room held its breath. Magidson and Merrill were found guilty of second-degree murder, not first. Cazares's trial ended in a hung jury. The jury had rejected the most violent aspects of the panic defense, but they also hesitated to name what happened as cold, premeditated murder. There was no hate crime enhancement, because, at that time, California's hate crime statute didn't explicitly include gender identity. The sentence felt like justice, but only partially. Gwen had been killed with intent. And yet, the full weight of her killer's motives, the transphobia, the rage, the dehumanization, was never fully acknowledged by the law. Still, Sylvia refused to let her daughter's name fade. She spoke to the press. She stood at rallies. She told Gwen's story again and again, so the world would remember that Gwen wasn't just a victim. She was a daughter, a sister, a fighter, and a girl who wanted to live her truth in a world that made it dangerous to do so. From the ashes of grief, a movement began to rise. Gwen Araujo's name didn't fade into silence. It became a rallying cry. In the aftermath of the trial, as the public processed the tragedy and the court's verdicts, Sylvia Guerrero transformed her mourning into movement. Gwen's story spread far beyond Newark, California. It traveled through newspapers, television screens, and advocacy circles, igniting national conversations around trans rights, hate crimes, and the dangers of systemic transphobia. What happened to Gwen was no longer just a local tragedy. It became a symbol of the violence faced by transgender people everywhere. In 2006, California took its first step toward honoring her legacy. The state passed the Gwen Araujo Justice for Victims Act, aimed at limiting the use of panic defenses in court. The law required that juries be instructed not to let bias, whether against someone's gender identity or sexual orientation, affect their judgment in criminal cases. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. A first breath of justice in a system that had too often looked away. Schools across the state began using Gwen's story in anti-bullying curricula. Documentaries, films, and books were created in her memory. Even mainstream media, often slow to address trans issues, began using her name with care. Not Edward, not biological male, just Gwen. And yet, even as awareness grew, Sylvia knew that real change was fragile. She traveled tirelessly to speak at high schools, churches, and LGBTQ+ centers. She talked not just about Gwen, but about the need for families to love their children, fully without condition. She spoke about how she once struggled to understand Gwen's transition, and how she would give anything to go back and embrace her daughter more fiercely while she still had the chance. She was beautiful, Sylvia would say, holding up a photo of Gwen in makeup, smiling brightly. She was everything, but the grief never softened. Sylvia battled depression and financial hardship. She said in interviews that some days, the only thing keeping her going was Gwen's memory, and the belief that if she kept speaking, maybe one more parent would listen. Maybe one more life could be saved. In communities across the country, Gwen's legacy sparked deeper questions. What protections exist for trans youth? How do we teach empathy in schools? Why are transgender individuals, especially trans women of color, murdered at such alarming rates? with so few of their cases ever reaching headlines or courts. Even years later, Gwen's case remains a haunting benchmark, not because it was unique, but because it was so painfully familiar. It showed how quickly curiosity could become cruelty, and how fragile the boundary is between fascination and violence when gender is misunderstood or feared. In Gwen's short life, she had only begun to discover herself. Her dreams, her laughter, her dancing, all cut short. But in death, she became a catalyst, a reminder, a face behind the statistics, and her mother, with unwavering strength, made sure the world remembered. In the months and years following Gwen Araujo's murder, the world slowly moved on, but the echoes of her story continued to reverberate, far beyond what the headlines had captured. For many, Gwen's name became more than just a symbol of tragedy. It became a rallying point in a broader fight for visibility, justice, and respect for transgender lives, particularly for young trans women of color, who, like Gwen, are disproportionately targeted by violence. But beyond the rallies and the courtrooms, there was still a silence in classrooms, in homes, in communities where Gwen's story was never spoken aloud. In these spaces, the lessons of her life were at risk of being forgotten. Sylvia Guerrero refused to let that happen. Her public advocacy took her across the country. She appeared at vigils and panels, telling Gwen's story to lawmakers, educators, and families who had never met a transgender person before. She worked to break through ignorance with raw, unfiltered truth, the kind that couldn't be ignored. She was not some stranger. She was my daughter, Sylvia would say. She loved dancing. She loved her brothers. She loved life. And she wasn't alone. Across the country, trans advocates, allies, and organizations rallied in Gwen's name. They pushed for changes in school policies, more robust hate crime laws, and better protections for LGBTQ+ youth. Slowly, the words Gwen Araujo became shorthand for a movement, one fighting not just for justice after death, but for dignity in life. But the fight was not easy. Even as Gwen's story became widely known, so did the challenges of keeping that momentum alive. New cases emerged, each bearing tragic similarities. Trans women attacked or killed, families grieving, communities split between compassion and cruelty. Gwen's name would be invoked time and again, each time asking the same painful question: how many more? For Sylvia, the passage of time brought no peace, only a deepening determination. She faced personal battles, including financial instability, emotional trauma, and the unbearable weight of being a mother without her child. But still, she kept going. She found strength in the strangers who came up to her after speeches, in the teens who told her Gwen's story helped them come out, in the parents who chose acceptance over fear. And slowly, the story of Gwen Araujo became not just about how she died, but about what her life made possible. In schools across California, her name is now part of the curriculum, a permanent part of the conversation. LGBTQ+ centers bear her story as part of their mission. Artists, playwrights, and filmmakers have continued to tell her story in new forms, reminding the world that Gwen was never just a case file or courtroom name. She was a person, and perhaps most remarkably, Gwen's murder sparked legal and cultural ripples that continue to this day. The Gwen Araujo Justice for Victims Act was just the beginning. Years later, California would become the first state to ban the use of the gay and trans panic defense altogether, a major step toward protecting LGBTQ+ individuals in courtrooms nationwide. None of it undid what happened, but all of it mattered, because beyond the headlines, Gwen's story continues. In every trans child who feels safer because the world remembers her name. In every courtroom where justice is no longer distorted by prejudice. And in every mother who chooses love over fear. Gwen Araujo's legacy became more than a movement. It became a change in the fabric of the law. The legal fight that began with her murder would ripple through California's justice system and eventually across the United States. Her story, tragic and raw, exposed how vulnerable transgender individuals were in a society that still struggled to understand and accept gender identity. But perhaps more importantly, it illuminated a legal loophole that could allow someone to use their victim's gender identity against them, literally claiming that the discovery of someone being transgender could excuse violence. The trans panic defense, a legal argument that claimed perpetrators were temporarily insane after learning that their victim was transgender or gay, was used to justify brutal acts of violence against LGBTQ+ people. In the wake of Gwen's death, many saw it as an archaic and dangerous loophole, one that could be exploited to justify murder. Sylvia Guerrero knew this wasn't just about her daughter anymore. It was about ensuring that no other family had to endure the same heartache. She made it her mission to ensure that Gwen's death would lead to change. In 2006, California passed the Gwen Araujo Justice for Victims Act, the first piece of legislation designed to limit the use of panic defenses in cases where a victim's gender identity or sexual orientation was the trigger for a crime. The law required that juries be instructed that discovery of someone's transgender status could not be used as an excuse for violence. Essentially, the law stated that panic was not a justification for murder. It wasn't perfect, but it was a monumental step forward. It was a recognition that the law could not condone violence based on gender identity or sexual orientation. This victory was personal for Sylvia, but it was also symbolic. It was a lifeline for trans people, particularly those who feared that they could be treated as less than human in the eyes of the law. Yet, even as the law shifted, Sylvia couldn't ignore the cultural stigma that still lingered. The world had shifted, but just enough to allow room for further change. Transgender people were still vulnerable, more so than ever before. The fear, hatred, and ignorance about gender identity were still deeply rooted in many communities. But Sylvia never gave up. While she fought tirelessly for legal protections, she also worked to shift public perception. She pushed for LGBTQ+ education in schools, knowing that awareness and acceptance needed to grow from the ground up. Sylvia became a tireless advocate for young transgender people, ensuring that the next generation of youth had stronger protections, more support, and a broader understanding of who they were and how they deserved to be treated. Her advocacy helped shape California's expansion of anti-discrimination laws and expanded hate crime protections for transgender people. Sylvia's relentless commitment was rooted not in anger, but in love for her daughter and for every young trans person who would come after her. And slowly, the stigma began to erode. People began to understand the reality of transgender lives, not just the tragedy, but the humanity behind the headlines. In 2010, Sylvia Guerrero was invited to testify before the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee to advocate for stronger hate crime legislation. Her testimony, raw and emotional, called for better protections for transgender people across the country. "I will never stop fighting for my daughter," she said through tears, "and I will fight for every person who faces hate, violence, or rejection simply because they are different." Gwen's name had transformed from that of a victim into a rallying cry for justice and equality. No longer was she just a face on a flyer. She was a legal catalyst, a force for policy change, and a symbol of resistance against hate. Though she would never walk this earth again, Gwen Araujo's spirit lived on in every fight for transgender rights, in every person who chose love and acceptance, in every law that grew stronger in her name. Even as Sylvia Guerrero stood before crowds and shared her daughter's story, the fight for justice remained far from over. Gwen's death, though acknowledged by law and the public, was a stark reminder of how vulnerable transgender people were, especially trans women of color. For every victory in the courtroom, for every law passed, there were still many more cases that went unnoticed, their victims' stories unshared. The world that had embraced Gwen's name and her legacy was not the world that had protected her. Though the Gwen Araujo Justice for Victims Act had passed, hate crimes against transgender people continued to rise, particularly within marginalized communities. Trans women, especially Black and Latinx trans women, were still at an elevated risk of violence, and the law did little to intervene before the damage was done. Sylvia knew that the legal victories were only the beginning. Changing hearts and minds, she understood, was where the real work would lie. By 2015, the public's understanding of gender identity had evolved. Transgender visibility was at an all-time high, thanks to shows like Transparent and high-profile figures like Caitlyn Jenner. Yet, this visibility was a double-edged sword. While it created space for conversations around transgender rights, it also opened the door for backlash, hate, and violence. Sylvia, now well known across advocacy circles, knew that change would take more than just laws. It would take community, education, awareness, and compassion. She worked with LGBTQ+ organizations to help schools understand the importance of safe spaces and the need for gender-inclusive policies. The fight for trans rights became part of a broader social justice movement, but Sylvia's personal mission never wavered. She continued to push for stronger policies, including laws that would protect trans youth from bullying and better healthcare access for transgender individuals. She also worked tirelessly to end conversion therapy, a harmful practice that tried to force trans individuals to fit within binary gender norms. At the same time, Sylvia began receiving messages from families across the nation, each one offering a story of loss similar to hers. The stories she heard weighed heavily on her heart. She knew that for every Gwen Araujo, there were dozens of other young people who didn't have their voices heard. In 2016, she began a new initiative, Gwen's Voice, a grassroots program aimed at providing emotional and legal support to the families of transgender people who had been murdered, as well as offering resources for youth transitioning or coming out. The foundation would offer workshops, offer scholarships to trans students, and, perhaps most importantly, offer a sense of hope to families who had experienced loss like hers. Sylvia wanted these families to feel less alone, to understand that their loved ones' stories could matter, too. Though the world had become more aware of the dangers trans people faced, Sylvia also realized that acceptance would not come without continual effort. The path to equality would always be met with resistance, and progress would only be achieved through persistence. This became her mantra. Despite the advances in law and policy, violence against transgender people did not stop. In fact, the numbers of trans people murdered each year remained disproportionately high. Many of these cases went unsolved, their victims forgotten in the noise of daily life. And in the years following Gwen's death, Sylvia saw her daughter's name slowly fade from the national conversation. What had once been a cultural turning point, the story of a young woman violently erased for daring to live authentically, was now just another name among many. The unfinished fight, however, was never too far from Sylvia's mind. The fight for gender equality, for transgender rights, for justice, was still being waged every single day. Sylvia had taken one fight as far as it would go, but she also knew her work was far from over. Gwen's death had not been in vain, but her life was more than just a victim's story. Gwen Araujo's fight continued on through every person who fought for her legacy. And in Sylvia's heart, her daughter's voice would never be silenced. Subscribe to True Crimes Archives for more chilling true crime stories, and remember to engage responsibly.